Sheremetyevo Airport, Moscow, June 1975. The Aeroflot Tupolev Tu-154 sits on the tarmac, its jet engines whining in the damp evening air. Inside the terminal, the atmosphere is thick with cigarette smoke and the muted tension of a police state. Border guards in olive-green uniforms move with deliberate slowness, examining each passport with a cold, penetrating stare. They are the visible edge of a vast, unseen machine, the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti, the KGB. Their domain is absolute here, a controlled ecosystem of fear and control where nothing escapes their notice. A man approaches the passport control booth. He is calm, his documents in order, a diplomatic passport. He is a foreign diplomat, leaving the Soviet Union. To the guards, he is a routine entry in the logbook, but the man's heart is a hammer against his ribs. His mind replays the last 48 hours in a silent, frantic loop. A covert signal activated, a dead drop cleared, a desperate coded message received. He knows that at this very moment, teams of KGB surveillance officers, the Slezhka, are scouring the city for him. They are looking for a ghost, a traitor who has slipped through their fingers. He places his passport on the counter. The guard's eyes flick from the photograph to his face, a practiced, searching look. A moment stretches into an eternity. Then, the dull thud of an entry stamp. Permission granted. He walks across the polished floor, through the final doors, and up the metal stairs into the aircraft. As the door seals shut behind him, the Tu-154 begins to taxi. It lifts into the grey Moscow sky, turning west. On the ground, in the labyrinth of offices at Lubyanka and the nearby Kontora, a profound, silent fury begins to crystallize. A top-level CIA asset has just escaped right under their noses. This event did not just represent an intelligence coup, it was a deep personal humiliation for the world's most powerful secret police. The stage for this escape, however, was set years earlier, in the darkest days of the CIA's Moscow station. The 1970s represented the uneasy pinnacle of the Cold War's strategic stalemate. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction cast a long, nuclear shadow over global politics, but the real war was fought in the shadows, a silent, relentless conflict of intelligence and subversion. For the United States and the Soviet Union, the ultimate prize was not territory, but secrets, military blueprints, Politburo deliberations, technological schematics. The front lines of this war were not marked by trenches, but by the invisible boundaries of surveillance zones in world capitals. And the most challenging, most dangerous battlefield of all for Western intelligence was Moscow itself. Within the Soviet capital, the KGB was not merely a security service, it was the central nervous system of the state, an omnipresent force woven into the fabric of daily life. Its power was absolute, and its methodology systematic. The second chief directorate, responsible for internal counterintelligence and the surveillance of foreigners, operated with near impunity. For a CIA officer under diplomatic cover in Moscow, life was a meticulously staged play performed under a blinding spotlight. Their apartments were bugged, their cars fitted with hidden tracking devices. The goal was not always to arrest, but to suffocate, to isolate, to render the officer operationally sterile. The environment was so oppressive that acquiring a human source, a Soviet citizen willing to commit treason, was considered the pinnacle of espionage achievement, and keeping that source alive was a constant, nerve-shredding battle against a seemingly omniscient adversary. For the CIA's Moscow station in the early 1970s, the situation was dire. A series of compromises, betrayals, and sophisticated KGB counterintelligence operations had left its network gutted. Penetrating the Soviet political or military apparatus felt almost impossible. The few assets who were recruited often met grim fates, their betrayal swiftly uncovered. The KGB's confidence was sky-high, bolstered by a string of victories. They believed their control was total, their system impermeable to Western spies. This arrogance, however, bred a specific kind of blindness, a belief in their own invincibility that could be exploited. Into this tense, high-stakes environment walked a man who had become one of the CIA's most valuable assets of the Cold War. His CIA cryptonym was Trigon. The man who would become Trigon was Alexander Dmitrievich Ogorodnik. He was not a stereotypical disgruntled minor functionary. He was a rising star within the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MID, a skilled economist and diplomat posted to the Soviet embassy in Bogota, Colombia, in the early 1970s. Ogorodnik was intelligent, cultured, and possessed a worldview that had been subtly cracked open by exposure to the West. He witnessed the contrast between the Soviet narrative and the reality he saw, and he held a deep-seated personal grievance against the system following a family tragedy linked to state failure. He was, in the precise language of espionage, a walk-in, but one of immense potential. In 1973, in Bogota, he made his move, secretly contacting the CIA station. His motivation was a complex blend of ideology, personal anger, and a desire for a different life. Recognizing his unparalleled access, the CIA moved quickly and carefully. He was given the cryptonym Trigon, and after rigorous validation, formally recruited. His training began in earnest. He was taught tradecraft, how to detect surveillance, how to conduct dead drops, how to communicate covertly. Crucially, he was provided with a specialized piece of espionage technology that would become central to his story: a miniature camera for photographing documents and a unique fountain pen. This was no ordinary pen. It was a sophisticated container for espionage tools, and most importantly, it held a lethal cyanide pill, an L pill, concealed within its barrel. The pill was a grim last resort, a final agency granted to an agent operating in the heart of a regime where capture meant torture, a show trial, and execution. In 1975, Ogorodnik's foreign posting ended. He was recalled to Moscow to a desk job at the Latin American department of the MID. For the CIA, this was a moment of both extreme opportunity and profound danger. They now had a well-placed source inside the very citadel of Soviet power, but running an asset in Moscow was the ultimate test. The task of handling Trigon fell to a remarkable officer, Martha Marty Peterson. She was the wife of a CIA officer under diplomatic cover, which gave her a degree of protective coloration, but she was also a trained, case-hardened operations officer in her own right. As the principal contact for Trigon, her job was to service dead drops, hidden locations where Ogorodnik would leave film cassettes filled with photographed documents, and where she would leave packages of cash, instructions, and new equipment. Every meeting was a potential trap. Every drop site could be under watch. The margin for error was zero. For months, the operation ran with silent efficiency. Trigon's intelligence was of breathtaking quality. Photographs of sensitive MID cables, insights into Soviet foreign policy thinking, details on diplomatic strategies. He was, in effect, providing a live feed from the enemy's innermost councils. Each successful drop by Peterson was a small miracle, a flaw in the KGB's supposedly perfect armor. The CIA in Langley began to breathe a little easier. But in the labyrinth of Lubyanka, the KGB's counterintelligence machinery was never truly still. They may not have known Trigon's identity, but they were aware of a leak. The hunt was on. The stage was now set for a catastrophic compromise, one that would test every piece of tradecraft, every personal resolve, and every piece of technology involved. The drama would unfold from multiple intersecting angles: the human, the technical, the tactical, and the psychological. At the core of the Trigon operation were two individuals whose lives became inextricably linked in a dance of immense risk. Their psychology, their motivations, and their relationship, though conducted entirely through impersonal dead drops and sterile signals, formed the fragile human backbone of the entire high-stakes endeavour. Alexander Ogorodnik, Trigon, was a man living a profound existential contradiction. By day, he was a loyal, efficient Soviet diplomat, moving through the hallways of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on Smolenskaya Square. He attended meetings, drafted memoranda, and navigated the intricate social codes of the Soviet nomenklatura. By night, and in the stolen moments between, he was a traitor. His motivations were complex and deeply personal. While ideological disillusionment with the system played a role, sources indicate a more visceral driver, a searing personal loss, a tragedy he blamed directly on the state's callous incompetence. This grief hardened into a cold, focused desire to strike back. Yet he was no unfeeling automaton. He enjoyed the finer things: good music, literature, romance. The CIA provided him not just with operational tools, but with items for his personal comfort: Western medicines, quality clothing, currency. These were not merely payments, they were tokens of a different world, reinforcing his psychological split. He lived with the constant, corrosive fear of discovery. a fear he managed by embracing the clinical rituals of his tradecraft and by placing a desperate faith in the device that promised him a way out of torture, the cyanide pill in his pen. On the other end of this silent dialogue was Martha Peterson. As the first female CIA operations officer to serve in Moscow, she was already a pioneer, operating in a doubly hostile environment, the KGB's playgrounds and a historically male-dominated field. Her cover as a diplomatic spouse provided access, but also constraints. Her strength was a formidable blend of analytical coolness and physical courage. Peterson understood the operational landscape with crystal clarity. She knew that every time she left the embassy compound, she was trailed. Her job was not to lose the surveillance, that was often impossible, but to manage it, to create a fleeting, exploitable moment of blackness where she could perform her task unseen. Her relationship with Trigon was entirely abstract, yet intensely personal. She studied his handwriting on signal plans. She handled the film canisters that contained the product of his peril. She was his sole lifeline to the outside world, the guardian of his safety. This responsibility weighed heavily, a constant undercurrent beneath her calm exterior. She was both his protector and, operationally, his greatest potential point of failure. Every move she made was a calculated risk with a man's life in the balance. The mechanics of the Trigon operation were a masterpiece of Cold War spycraft, a precise and deadly ballet performed on a stage designed by the KGB. Communication was asynchronous and invisible. Signal sites, inconspicuous public locations like a specific lamppost or a crack in a wall, were used to send one-bit messages. These signals allowed Ogorodnik and Peterson to communicate without ever meeting, reducing exposure. The heart of the material exchange was the dead drop, DLB. Ogorodnik would select a hidden location, a hollow in a tree, a crevice in a crumbling wall, a space under a specific bridge, to deposit a miniature container, often a modified 35mm film canister loaded with rolls of exposed film. Photographed onto that film were images of classified EMID documents. Peterson's task was to service this drop, to locate it, retrieve the film, and leave a package for Trigon containing money, new film, instructions, and personal items. The act of loading or unloading a drop took seconds but required hours of preparation. To execute this, Peterson employed surveillance detection runs, SDRs. These were elaborate, meandering routes through Moscow, designed to exhaust, confuse, and ultimately lose the Slezhka teams following her. She would use the metro, buses, and foot patrols, changing her appearance with coats and hats, entering and exiting buildings with multiple exits. If she determined she was black, she would move swiftly to the drop site. The KGB, masters of the same art, were constantly adapting, using large teams, relay tactics, and stationary observation posts. Each servicing run was a high-stakes game of chess where a single mistake, a moment of carelessness, a change in the KGB's pattern, a piece of bad luck, could lead to disaster. The tradecraft was a language of paranoia and precision, where survival depended on reading the invisible signs of the city and the silent, watching eyes that filled it. In the sterile technical arena of espionage, the CIA's Office of Technical Service, OTS, the Q branch of the real world, provided the critical edge that made the Trigon operation feasible. These were not fantastical gadgets, but elegantly minimalist solutions to life-or-death problems, engineered for concealment and deniability. The most iconic device was the Trigon pen. To any casual observer, it was a high-quality, functional fountain pen, but its internal mechanics were a marvel of clandestine engineering. The barrel unscrewed to reveal a hidden compartment. Within this space, Ogorodnik could store microfilm or receive tightly rolled instructions. More significantly, the pen's clip was designed to be manipulated in a specific sequence. This was not intended as a weapon, but as an instrument of last resort. Its presence acknowledged a grim reality. Capture by the KGB meant protracted torture and a humiliating show trial. The pill offered a final, desperate measure of control, a way to deny the enemy information, to protect the network, and to choose the manner of one's own death. For Ogorodnik, the pen was both his most valuable tool and a constant, morbid companion. The intelligence itself was captured through miniature photography. Ogorodnik was supplied with a covert camera, likely a modified sub-miniature model like the Tessina, or a custom device, small enough to be concealed in a hand or a book. Using this, he would photograph documents in his office or at home, often late at night. The film used was ultra-fine grain, allowing for dozens of document images to be captured on a single small cassette. These cassettes, themselves often disguised, were the physical payload of the dead drops. On the other side, Peterson's kit was equally focused. She carried load packages for the drops, innocuous-looking containers that held the new film, money, often in non-sequential, untraceable rubles, and encrypted commo plans. She also possessed her own surveillance detection tools, small mirrors for observing tails, a watch for precise timing, and an unwavering mental map of Moscow's back alleys and metro schedules. This technology was not about flashy spectacle. It was about enabling a silent, tangible transfer of secrets under the nose of a technologically sophisticated adversary and providing a grim failsafe for when all else failed. Opposing them was not just an organization, but an institution that was an integral part of the state's foundation. The KGB's Second Chief Directorate, SCD, viewed Moscow as its private, sealed kingdom. Their confidence in 1975 was not mere arrogance. It was built upon a decades-long record of dominance. They had turned CIA officers, rolled up networks, and created an atmosphere of such pervasive dread that potential dissidents would often report on themselves. Their surveillance was not merely reactive, it was a proactive, layered system. The Slezhka, surveillance teams, were their eyes and feet. They worked in large rotating groups using cars, motorcycles and foot units in a complex relay. They were trained to be forgettable, to blend into the urban landscape. Beyond physical tales, the SCD employed technical surveillance on an industrial scale. Every foreign diplomat's residence and office was wired with listening devices, bugs. Telephones were tapped as a matter of course. A vast army of audio monitors, translators, and analysts worked around the clock in monitoring centres, sifting through thousands of hours of mundane conversation for a single slip. They also ran provocation agents provocateurs who would pose as disaffected Soviets or Western sympathisers to entrap intelligence officers. This created a mindset of near invincibility within the Lubyanka. The system was considered airtight. The idea that a high-value asset like Trigon could operate for months under their noses and that a CIA officer could successfully service him was an affront to their entire professional identity. Their operational philosophy was one of overwhelming mass and patience. They would blanket a target with so much surveillance that eventually the target would make a mistake. They believed they held all the advantages: time, territory, and absolute legal power. This very confidence, however, contained a latent vulnerability. It could breed complacency in routine, a reliance on pattern, and a shocking inability to conceive of an opponent audacious or skilled enough to find the microscopic gaps in their armour. The stage was now set for a collision between this confident Leviathan and a meticulously planned, technologically aided, and humanly desperate operation. The catalyst for that collision would be a single catastrophic breach. The precise trigger for Trigon's exposure remains one of the most debated and opaque chapters of the Cold War. Some evidence points to a betrayal, a hint from a well-placed mole within Western intelligence, perhaps from the compromised CIA officer Edward Lee Howard years later, whose knowledge, while chronologically questionable, echoed in later KGB debriefings. Other theories suggest a more mundane, lethal flaw, a pattern discerned by the KGB's vast analytical machinery. A series of successful intelligence coups by the West on Soviet diplomatic positions may have triggered a furious mole hunt within the Midi. Through process of elimination, profiling, or possibly technical intercepts of his clandestine communications, the KGB's focus began to narrow. What is certain is that by the early summer of 1975, the noose was tightening around Alexander Ogorodnik. The end came not in a dramatic chase, but in the quiet confines of his Moscow apartment. On or around June 15, 1975, KGB officers of the Second Chief Directorate moved in. The arrest was likely conducted with controlled efficiency, designed to shock and disorient. They would have entered early in the morning, presenting their credentials with cold formality. For Ogorodnik, the world he had been dreading for years had finally materialized. The fear was now a concrete reality. The grim-faced men, the search of his belongings, the inevitable journey to the Lubyanka or one of its subsidiary prisons like the infamous Lefortovo. He was now in the absolute power of the institution he had betrayed. At the interrogation facility, the process would have begun not with violence but with psychological pressure. The KGB interrogators were masters of a patient, grinding method. They would present an air of omniscience, implying they knew everything, that cooperation was his only path. They would have laid out evidence, real or fabricated, to break down his defences. They wanted names, procedures, signal sites, drop locations. They wanted his handler. For Ogorodnik, the calculus of survival had reached its terminus. He knew what prolonged interrogation meant: endless psychological torment, eventual physical torture, a broken confession for a televised trial, and then a bullet to the back of the head. He also knew he possessed one final terrible card to play, the agency granted to him by his CIA handlers. At some point during this initial interrogation, perhaps when left alone in a holding cell or during a moment of inattention, Ogorodnik made his choice. He asked for a cigarette or a glass of water, or simply reached into his pocket as if for a handkerchief. He produced the fountain pen. To his captors, it was a mundane personal effect already searched and deemed harmless. They did not see the specific practice sequence of twists he applied to the clip. The mechanism released. He placed the pen to his mouth as if thoughtful, or to drink. The tiny glass vial containing potassium cyanide crumbled between his teeth. The effect was near instantaneous. Cyanide inhibits cellular respiration, causing a rapid, agonizing systemic shutdown. Within seconds, Ogorodnik would have convulsed and collapsed. The KGB interrogators, moments before in total control, were now witnessing a catastrophic operational failure unfold before their eyes. Their prized catch, the key to unravelling a major CIA network, was dying on the floor. Medical help, if summoned, would have been futile. The dose was designed to be unequivocally fatal. In his final act, Trigon had exercised the ultimate denial. He had protected his handlers, his network, and stolen from the KGB the victory of a full confession. But he had also left behind a furious, humiliated, and now dangerously motivated security apparatus. Their attention now turned with laser focus to the other half of the equation, the American who was scheduled to come looking for him. Martha Peterson, following the operational schedule, would have been watching for a signal from Trigon indicating a loaded dead drop. Unaware of the storm that had just broken, she prepared for her most dangerous run. The KGB, reeling from Ogorodnik's suicide, saw a chance for redemption. They would turn the drop site into a trap. The KGB now faced a race against time. They had lost Trigon, but they knew his tradecraft. They had his apartment, his belongings, and likely his signal plans. Embassy compound. This knowledge presented them with a critical opportunity. Diplomat, in the middle of espionage, seizing the spy gear and generating a massive propaganda coup. More importantly, it would salvage their honour. They prepared the ambush with their signature thoroughness. The area around Service Road 7 would have been saturated with officers. Surveillance teams, both mobile and static, were positioned to cover every approach and escape route. Spetsnaz operatives from the elite Alpha Group, or officers from the 7th Directorate, trained in ambush and capture, were likely concealed in the surrounding bushes and undergrowth. The dead drop itself, a hollow metal stump or a hidden crevice, was almost certainly under direct observation, possibly wired with a silent alarm or surrounded by pressure-sensitive materials. They waited with the patience of predators, believing the trap was flawless. They were confident that the American, following the routine, would walk into it. On the evening of July 15, 1975, Martha Peterson initiated her surveillance detection run. The atmosphere in Moscow was thick with summer humidity. She followed her intricate SDR, changing transport, doubling back, using crowds. Her senses were tuned to their highest pitch, searching for the telltale signs of the Slezhka. The same faces, the predictable patterns, the too casual loiterers. At a certain point, she made her operational judgment. In reality, the KGB, forewarned of the probable drop zone, may have been employing a loose box technique, keeping a wider perimeter to avoid spooking her, knowing the final destination was sealed. Peterson made her way toward the river and Service Road 7. The area was quiet, dusk settling in. She approached the drop site, every nerve alert. Her mission was twofold: to retrieve the film canister Trigon should have left, and to deposit a new package for him. As she neared the location, the normal sounds of the evening, crickets, distant traffic, may have seemed unnaturally muted. She reached for the hiding place. The moment her fingers touched the drop, the night erupted. Powerful flashlight beams snapped on, blinding her. From the shadows, large figures lunged. The shout, "Stoy! KGB! Stop!" shattered the silence. Hands grabbed her, restraining her arms. She was surrounded. In that instant, Peterson understood everything. Trigon was compromised, the operation was blown, and she was caught in flagrante. Her training took over. The primary goal now was denial and destruction. As she was seized, she managed in the struggle to hurl the package she was carrying, containing cash, new film, and instructions, into the nearby Moscow River. The swift current carried it away before the KGB officers could retrieve it. It was a small but critical act of defiance, denying them physical evidence of her intent to spy. She was dragged to a waiting KGB van. Inside, a female officer conducted a rough search. They found on her person the tools of her trade: a map, signal plans, and, most damningly, a list of dead drop sites in Moscow, including Service Road 7. The evidence was incontrovertible. S Embassy. The KGB officers were likely a mix of triumphant and furious. They had caught their spy, but the asset was dead, and key evidence had just floated away down the river. Peterson was taken not to Lubyanka, but to a KGB safe house for immediate interrogation. For several hours, KGB officers pressed her, attempting to get her to confess, to provide details about Trigon and the CIA's Moscow operations. She remained steadfast, repeating her demand for embassy contact. Embassy, her failure to return triggered emergency protocols. The embassy contacted the Soviet Foreign Ministry, demanding to know the whereabouts of their diplomat. The KGB found themselves in a difficult and deeply embarrassing position. They had caught a spy red-handed, but their ultimate prize, Trigon, was gone. They had some physical evidence from Peterson, but the most incriminating package was lost. Diplomat would create a major international incident. After intense internal discussions, the political decision was made. They could not prosecute Martha Peterson without revealing the depth of their own failure, the successful running of a high-level mole, and his subsequent suicide. The propaganda value of parading her was outweighed by the humiliating admission that the CIA had penetrated them so deeply. Within days, Martha Peterson was declared persona non grata and expelled from the Soviet Union. She was put on a plane out of Sheremetyevo, the same airport from which her asset had escaped weeks earlier. For the KGB, it was a bitter, hollow victory. They had cleared a traitor from their ranks and expelled a CIA officer, but they had been denied the full narrative control they craved. The world did not see a triumphant counter-espionage smash. Instead, a quiet, tense expulsion took place, hinting at a much deeper failure. The asset was dead, but he had escaped their grasp in the most final way possible, and his handler had walked away, denying them crucial evidence. The meticulously constructed myth of KGB omnipotence within Moscow had been publicly and painfully punctured. The aftermath would ripple through the corridors of Lubyanka and Langley for years to come. The fallout from the Trigon affair was immediate, stark, and played out on the Cold War's diplomatic stage. Martha Peterson, after her brief detention and interrogation, was formally expelled from the Soviet Union on July 19, 1975. Embassy, Martha D. Peterson, for activities incompatible with her diplomatic status, the standard euphemism for espionage. There was no triumphant press conference, no parade of captured spy gear. The silence from the KGB side was telling. They had no asset to present, no dramatic confession to broadcast. The State Department issued a predictable denial of improper activity. But within the CIA, her expulsion was recognized for what it was, the catastrophic but contained endpoint of a brilliantly successful, though tragically concluded, operation. Peterson's return to Washington was met not with censure, but with quiet professional respect. She had performed her duties with courage under unimaginable pressure and had, in her final moments of freedom, denied the KGB a key piece of evidence. She was later awarded the CIA's Intelligence Star for her valor. Her expulsion, however, delivered a severe tactical blow to Moscow Station. A trained, experienced operations officer was lost, and the specific tradecraft and dead-drop networks she managed were completely burned. The station was forced into a period of extreme caution, its ability to run human intelligence operations within Moscow severely degraded. On the Soviet side, the internal repercussions were far more severe. While the public face was one of stern resolution, internally, the KGB was reeling. The sequence of events represented a cascading failure. First, a high-level mole had operated undetected for nearly 2 years inside a sensitive ministry. Second, that mole had committed suicide during initial interrogation, denying them intelligence and making them look incompetent. And third, their ambush of the handler, while technically successful in catching her, had failed to secure all evidence and ended with a simple expulsion rather than a devastating propaganda victory. The humiliation was profound and personal for the leadership of the Second Chief Directorate. Heads likely rolled in the sections responsible for monitoring the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and tracking foreign diplomats. An intense, sweeping internal investigation was launched to determine how Ogorodnik had been recruited, how he had communicated, and who else might be implicated. The paranoia within the ranks of the MED and the KGB itself would have spiked, leading to purges, heightened security checks, and a climate of mistrust that damaged morale and efficiency. To understand the true scale of the KGB's failure, one must consider what Trigon had already delivered. Before his compromise, Alexander Ogorodnik had provided a steady stream of highly classified Soviet Foreign Ministry cables. These were not mere administrative documents. They contained candid assessments from Soviet ambassadors, debates on policy directions, and insights into the Kremlin's strategic thinking on key issues like détente, the Middle East, and relations with China. As policymakers and intelligence analysts, this was akin to reading the opponent's diplomatic playbook. It allowed them to anticipate Soviet moves, understand their red lines, and calibrate their own strategies with unprecedented precision. S government was tightly controlled under a special code word compartment, likely separate from the Trigon cryptonym itself. It informed President Gerald Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger at the highest levels. The value of this pipeline made the eventual loss so painful for the CIA, but the knowledge gained was irrevocable. It had exposed vulnerabilities in Soviet diplomatic thinking and provided a reality check against Soviet disinformation. The operation proved that even in the heart of the fortress, a motivated individual with the right tools could pierce the veil. This lesson was as valuable to the CIA as the documents themselves. But the story did not end with the expulsions and internal investigations. The Trigon case left deep scars and sparked significant evolution in the tradecraft of both superpowers. The pen, the suicide, and the successful ambush-turned diplomatic incident became legendary case studies, analysed and reanalyzed in the training academies of both the CIA and the KGB. The event marked a turning point, not in the Cold War's balance of power, but in its secret, shadowy methodology. The Trigon case sent seismic waves through the clandestine services of both superpowers, forcing painful introspection and driving evolution in espionage tradecraft. It was a defining lessons learned event, its details pored over in classified postmortems for decades. For the CIA, the immediate emotional response was grief for Ogorodnik and professional pride in Peterson's conduct. But operationally, the conclusions were sobering. The Moscow environment was even more lethal than assumed. The reliance on a single high-value asset with a single point of contact, the handler, was seen as a critical vulnerability. While Trigon's suicide had protected the operation, it also highlighted the extreme endgame of such relationships. In response, Moscow Station and the CIA's Soviet division began to place even greater emphasis on compartmentalization and redundancy. The use of impersonal communication, like the pioneering but risky Trigon pen as a two-way device, was studied for both its advantages and its ultimate limitations. The case underscored the non-negotiable need for exfiltration plans for high-level assets, though extracting someone from deep within Moscow remained the most daunting challenge in espionage. Martha Peterson's ability to ditch the load package also reinforced a fundamental tenet. Captured officers were trained to destroy evidence, even in the first seconds of capture, a lesson that became enshrined in training. For the KGB, the impact was corrosive. The affair was a stain on the record of the Second Chief Directorate and the leadership of Yuri Andropov. While publicly unacknowledged, the humiliation fueled an even more aggressive and paranoid counterintelligence posture. The hunt for moles intensified, leading to periods of internal purges that sometimes harmed their own efficiency. The failure also accelerated investment in technical means of detection. If human surveillance could be eluded, perhaps technology could not. This period saw a redoubling of efforts in signal intelligence, SIG-ENT, the development of more sophisticated bugs, and research into detecting the radio frequencies of clandestine transmitters. S-Embassy, culminating in the infamous Moscow signal microwave bombardment and the constant discovery of embedded listening devices in new construction materials. The case also entered the realm of myth and counter-myth. Within the CIA, Trigon and Peterson's story became a legend of courage and sacrifice, a proof that the impenetrable could be penetrated. For the KGB, the narrative was reshaped internally as a victory of eventual detection and neutralization. But the bitter aftertaste of the asset's escape via suicide and the limited gains from the handler's capture never fully dissipated. In 1985, he provided a glimpse of this lasting scar. He confirmed that the KGB had indeed identified Ogorodnik, and he recounted the official KGB version of events, a story that tried to frame the suicide as a minor detail in a broader counterintelligence success. Yet the very need to explain it a decade later showed how the case had lingered as a sensitive point of professional shame, and the story of the Trigon pen did not end in the interrogation room in 1975. In a stunning twist of Cold War irony, the physical instrument of Ogorodnik's final act would reappear years later, not as evidence, but as a trophy. In 1985, a senior CIA officer assigned to the Soviet Union was having his personal possessions packed by a State Department technician. Hidden among the officer's effects, the technician found a fountain pen. Recognizing it as unusual, he turned it over to the CIA's Office of Security. Technical experts examined it and made a chilling discovery. It was an identical model to the suicide pen given to Trigon, still containing its lethal cyanide capsule. It was never confirmed how this pen came to be in the officer's belongings, but the prevailing theory within the CIA was that it was a provocation planted by the KGB. The intent, analysts believed, was sinister and multifaceted. If discovered during a routine search by Soviet authorities, it would provide incontrovertible evidence of espionage. Alternatively, its mere presence could sow paranoia within the CIA ranks. Most darkly, it could have been meant as a morbid message, a reminder from the KGB that they knew the details of the Trigon case and that such an end could await others. The reappearance of the pen underscored that even a decade later, the operation's artifacts held power. It was a ghost from a buried past, proving that in the secret war, no story is ever fully closed, and no tool is ever truly retired. The legacy of Trigon was not just in the documents he copied, but in the shadows he left behind in the minds of his hunters and his handlers. This complex legacy of human sacrifice, technical ingenuity, institutional adaptation, and enduring shame sets the stage for a final reflection on what the event meant in the vast, silent narrative of the Cold War. The story of Trigon is not a tale of clear victory or defeat. It exists in the penumbra of the Cold War, a conflict measured not in territory seized, but in secrets stolen, trust broken, and lives shattered in silence. It represents the essential, tragic duality of espionage at its highest level, a monumental intelligence coup and a profound human tragedy existing in the same breath. On one scale, the operation was a stunning validation of the CIA's craft. It proved that even the most hardened totalitarian state, with its apparatus of fear and control, was vulnerable to the resolve of a single, disillusioned individual. The intelligence harvested from the heart of the Soviet Foreign Ministry provided a clarity that years of satellite imagery and signals intercepts could not, a window into the intent behind the Politburo's decisions. It was the ultimate prize of human intelligence: context, nuance, and foresight. Martha Peterson's cool courage under the blinding light of KGB surveillance became a benchmark for operational tenacity. Yet the cost calcified this success into something somber. Alexander Ogorodnik's fate is the dark heart of the story. He was not exfiltrated to a life of freedom and gratitude. He died alone on a concrete floor, choosing a vial of cyanide over the tender mercies of the state he betrayed. His final act was one of both supreme defiance and absolute despair. It underscores the brutal calculus of the era. Assets were not just sources, they were sacrificial pieces in a grand strategic game, their ultimate protection often nothing more than a tool for self-annihilation. The pen, that elegant piece of engineering, symbolizes this bleak contract, a lifeline that was also a death sentence. For the KGB, the humiliation was of a specific institutional kind. It was not a battlefield loss, but a failure of their foundational myth, the myth of omniscience within their own borders. They were shown to be reactive, not preventative, powerful, but not all-seeing. The suicide of Trigon denied them the catharsis of a completed narrative. They could not parade him, could not dissect his network fully, and could not claim a pure victory. Instead, they were left with a toxic brew of anger, embarrassment, and paranoia that poisoned their own halls. In the endless mirror-walled conflict, they had seen a crack in their own reflection. The legacy of the Trigon case, therefore, is one of sobering equilibrium. It demonstrated that no system is impermeable and no surveillance is perfect. It also demonstrated that the price of piercing that system is often measured in the currency of irreversible human loss. It forced both superpowers to adapt, to invest in better technology, more intricate tradecraft, and deeper paranoia. The operation faded into classified archives, but its lessons of courage, sacrifice, vulnerability, and shame continued to whisper in the corridors of Langley and Lubyanka long after the Berlin Wall fell. It remains a quintessential capsule of the Cold War's secret heart, a war fought not for glory but for fragments of truth, where the greatest triumphs were never celebrated and the deepest wounds never healed.